Hey, today we're talking about media bias, and this is something that, well, I've been reading a lot lately about this, and it's gotten to the point with the term fake news. Um, it's kind of sometimes hard to realize what is the truth and what is not the truth. And so, what we want to do here is to tell you how some people in the media might um, make the truth maybe harder to find. Um, but I do want to emphasize that there is truth out there, um, or at least your own truth, which I think is important, and it's usually based on facts. And so I want you to maybe realize that there's an importance of facts that you probably should use to defend your opinions, um, and that ignoring facts um, is maybe just as bad as making them up. And so let's talk a little bit about media bias here. Let's share the screen. And let's see if this is where, there we go. Now it's working, media and politics. And again, you might want to jot down some notes as we go through this. So first of all, I think the one thing you have to realize is that the people who are reporters who cover politics and cover things in the news, they have their own views of the world. Like, there isn't anyone who is totally open and totally free from bias. Okay, so when you realize this, and this is fine and this is great, and people should think for themselves, right? And they should have their own views. And so when you realize this, that they do, then that might help you understand how some people might not be telling you the complete truth, either on purpose or not. And this is when we talked about this thing called implicit bias, right? So implicit bias, it refers to the attitudes or stereotypes that affect our understanding, actions, and decisions in an unconscious manner, right? So there are things going on in our head that sometimes we don't quite understand or we don't quite identify. And so while we think we might be telling you the truth, unconsciously we're telling you the truth and how we see it, right? And what the truth is to us. And we all might have our different truths. And so this is kind of important to understand, is that someone could be telling you what they think is the truth, but it might not be the complete truth. And that gives you a lot more, it gives you more responsibility to try to find out what the real truth is and what the truth is to you. So that's kind of the point of this whole day, is to try to maybe figure out how people might not be telling you the truth, whether on purpose or implicitly, or the opposite of this is explicitly. Explicitly is like, clearly, I'm not going to tell you the truth. I'm going to tell you some falsehoods, or I'm going to leave things out or whatever. But there might be also some implicit bias. So keep those two things in mind. There are ways to be intentionally biased. And so we want to go through some of these. First of all, one is called story selection. What's important to know about story selection is that there probably has to be a pattern of this to claim that there's story selection bias in any news organization. So the pattern is where you only tell one side of one kind of story. So maybe there's a politician who you only tell good things about, and you kind of ignore the bad stories. And then you put those stories on your website or in your newspaper or on your TV channel or whatever. Excuse me. So this is very hard to do, right? If you have a certain way to see the world, then you might only focus on stories that make the other side look bad or your own side look good. So this is called story selection. There's also bias by commission, where you intentionally pass along stories or assumptions or maybe not complete truths to support one side or the other. So this is by taking an action, by putting out words, by putting out stories that make one side look good. This is bias by commission. The opposite of that is bias by omission, where you leave out the story that makes your side look bad, right? So commission is when you do something to make one side look good and you include it, Omission just means you just kind of ignore things and you don't put things in. That's bias by omission. Bias by placement means like where you place the news story. If it's a TV news, do you put it, first thing of the news, or is it like the last thing of the hour? If it's a newspaper, is it on the front page, or is it buried somewhere in the newspaper? And so certainly some people have some newspapers and TV shows and TV news does that. They place their news strategically in their news source, in their news presentation. There's the bias by the selection of sources, right? Where you only even call sources that will support your way of thinking. And you don't try to find out what the other side is thinking. This is a huge one, right? Really, anyone who wants to find out the truth, to find out if they're right or whatever, probably needs to make more of an effort to figure out what the other side is thinking or what the other side is reporting, to be totally, completely honest. But instead, what usually happens is they have their own sources that they call, who they know will only say things that agree with how they see the world. And so this is called bias by the selection of sources. There's also this thing called spin, right? Where somehow, no matter what the story is, no matter what, like everyone sees an event, or if everyone sees like a tweet by the president, so you can't really ignore that. Here's the fact. There's a tweet with words, and here's what the president says. And yet some people can spin this to make it sound better than it might be, or sound worse than it might be, to try to emphasize one worldview as opposed to the other. So if you can identify this, and if you know this is going to happen, or if you can listen to someone on the TV and you can hear the spin, then you can recognize that as a form of bias. And it happens all the time. There is bias by condemnation or bias by recommendation. And this is when a reporter or a news anchor or whatever clearly supports or criticizes a person or a policy. So news is supposed to tell you, like, here's what happened. And sometimes they'll tell you, here's why it happened. But they don't usually say, here's what happened, here's why it happened, and this is why the person who's doing it is a bad person. Or here's what happened, here's why it happened, and here's why it's the greatest thing ever. So that is infringing upon the world of bias when you start to make judgments for the viewers, for the readers, all of that. Watch out for bias by labeling. And this is this can be very subtle, when instead of someone who says, oh, here is please welcome the senator from Utah, which is fine, it's still a labeled senator, I guess, but that's the truth. But when you start to say things like, here's the extreme conservative senator from Utah, so to some people that's an accurate statement. To other people, it might not be. And when you say extreme conservative or extreme liberal, or extreme anything, right, it starts to convey a message of whether or not this person speaks for the mainstream of Americans. So people use labeling a lot, so be aware of that. And if you can catch them, especially using negative or positive labels to describe someone, that's a form of bias. They can say, like, oh, the well-liked congressman, or the warm and friendly Prime Minister of Canada, or whatever. So these kinds of labels isn't really news, right? It's just a way to further convey a certain way of looking at things. Maybe you watch the news. I hope you do. I don't know where you get your news from, and I'm afraid it's all from social media. And I got to tell you, one problem with social media that I've been working on a lot of thinking about anyways, is that most of the time it only gives you what you want to see or read, right? And so there's not many people who, through their social media, get news stories that might challenge their thinking. And certainly if you're a responsible human being, you should be open to being challenged by things. And if you get your news only through social media, maybe try to follow someone who you don't agree with. And by doing that, you can actually get the other side and maybe you might see more of the truth. Anyways, here are some of the biases that are sometimes levied against these various news sources. CNN is considered moderate to liberal. MSNBC is considered a liberal news source. Fox News is a very conservative news source. Oh, and I just used a label right there, right? I said very conservative. Like, how biased is that? But it's a conservative news source. The New York Times is a liberal news source. The Wall Street Journal, which is also published in New York City, is a conservative news source. The Washington Post is a liberal news source, and there's another Washington paper. It's not very big, though, which is more conservative. Here in Detroit, in Michigan, we have two newspapers in Detroit, the Free Press, which is the liberal newspaper, and the News is a conservative newspaper. But what's crazy is that that's one organization. The Detroit News and Free Press is one organization, and they print separate newspapers. So what's interesting is if you can find a news event in Michigan, you can go to the Free Press and find a liberal slant or a liberal spin on the news slant, and you'll see the news story told from a conservative side in the Detroit News. So I would highly recommend that to you. One of your assignments this week is to actually analyze a news source, and so it'd be great if you could find something that's important to Michigan and see how the Free Press and the News are telling it differently. And it's your assignment today is to find an example. So hopefully that was interesting. If any of those things are confusing to you, please drop me an email or a text and we'll clear things up. But I hope this helps in your understanding of how to interpret the media. So with that, please have a good time looking through the news, and I will see you next time. Thanks.